Before digging too deep into the controller and view code, I like to just stub out the controllers. This allows me to think a little bit more on what I actually need for the application. For example, I might need to account for another URL, or I might need to add something to the API for the service layer or even the data access layer. This also allows me to test the application, and I'm not particularly talking about test-driven development where you write unit tests. I'm talking about actually running the application and testing. I'll make a few requests and see if the application routes those requests to the appropriate controller and action methods. And then that, of course, allows me to tweak the routing table if I need to do so. I typically start with the entry point of the application, which in our case is the home controller. So let's add the home controller to our controllers folder, and Visual Studio is going to give us this index action method. We're going to stick with this convention. So the index action method for our home controller is going to return either the landing page view for users that are not logged in, or it will return the timeline view for users that are logged in. And for the rest of the action methods, we can look at our routing table, because this is essentially the blueprint for the URLs and the action methods that will handle those requests. As far as the home controller is concerned, we have the index action method already stubbed out, but we do need the create, the following, and the followers action methods. So let's go to the home controller, and I'm going to paste in followers and following. But instead of returning a view, I'm just going to throw a not implemented exception. This is advantageous, at least for me, because as I'm going through the application, if for some reason I forget to implement one of these methods, then I'm going to see that exception, and hey, I need to fix that. So let's add one for create. Now, create is going to be a little bit special because this is going to take information from the user and then add that information to the database. So this is not going to be a GET request. This is going to be a POST request. So we can go ahead and we can mark this as HTTP POST. And since this is a POST request, it probably makes sense to validate anti-forgery token. We will add the anti-forgery token whenever we create the create view. So in this, we will just throw a new not implemented exception. And as I'm going through this, it has occurred to me that we don't have a way of letting users follow other users and unfollow their users. So we need to add those URLs to our application. And it kind of makes sense to put those with the home controller because this is core functionality. So let's go ahead and let's add some action methods. We'll call one follow, the other unfollow. And we can just copy and paste our followers and following method, and we can just rename those to follow and unfollow. Something else we also need is a page that lists all of the users that have created an account. So we need a profile list, and that could be added to the home controller as well. So let's add a profiles action method, which will also throw a not implemented exception. One other thing we should do is mark the follow and the unfollow methods as HTTP POST, because those are going to be actions handling a POST request. We also need to validate the anti-forgery token for both of these action methods. So let's add that, and then we need to go back to our route config, and we need to add routes for those URLs, and I'm just going to paste those in. Now I know that we have a lot of entries within our routing table. Most of them are home. And the reason why is because of this route here. The first segment of our user default route is variable. And while it would be nice, we cannot add an action parameter for our default route because these two routes would then interfere with one another. If we received a request that didn't match any of our account or profile default routes, then it would automatically be handled by the user default route, which obviously won't work for anything on the home controller. So there are several solutions that you can use. I chose to add multiple entries for the routing table. Some other solutions would be to simply change the URL scheme so that we incorporated home within the URL. But I don't like that solution because that takes the friendliness away from our URLs. I like how they are. We could also combine the user controller with the home controller. And then inside of the controller, we could handle all of the different actions. That adds extra complexity to the controller, and I like to keep controllers as clean and simple as possible. So neither solution is really a win-win, but as far as achieving the goals, or at least my goals, of friendly URLs and simple and clean controllers, this is a suitable solution. Let's go back to our home controller, and let's think about some of the objects that we are going to need within these action methods. Well, first of all, we need to know the currently logged in user. And we have the security service class that gives us the ability to track the user ID. But it would be nice if we had a property for our controller that was the actual logged in user. So we could call it current user. We of course need access to the security service, so we would need something which I will call security. And these are really two things that we would need in every single controller that we write. So it kind of makes sense to write a base controller, which we can then inherit from for all of our other controllers. So let's do that. Let's add a base controller. We'll just call it Ribbit Controller Base. This needs to inherit controller, and we can go ahead and add our properties. Current user, which is of type user, and then security, which is of type iSecurity service. And let's go ahead and write a constructor that will create those objects for us. So public Ribbit Controller Base. We'll make this a default constructor, so we are basically going to tightly couple our data types together. So we can set the security property to a new security service. But in order to do this, we need a user service. So let's create a user service. And in fact, this might be something that we might need in our other controllers. So let's create a property. We'll call it users, and it is going to be of iUser service. We'll make this publicly gettable and privately settable. And then in the controller, we can set users equals new user service, but now we need an iContext object. Well, we can just new up our context class, which will give us our user service, which we can then pass in to our security service. And then we just need to set the current user. Now, we don't have an easy way of getting the current user. We could use the user service combined with the user ID from the security service, or we can just add a method to our security service that gets the currently logged in user. I like the idea of having a method, so let's go ahead and call security.getCurrentUser. Of course, we don't have this method. We will need to add it to our iSecurity service interface as well as the security service class. So let's go to services. Let's first go to our interface, and let's add the signature for that method. So since this is in alphabetical order, we want to put it after the doesUserExist method. And then inside of security service, let's keep this in alphabetical order as well. And we will simply return users.getBy and then pass in user ID. If the user is not logged in, then this is going to return null. Otherwise, it will return the user. Let's go back to our home controller, and let's change this from inheriting controller to inheriting Ribbit Controller Base. And let's create a default constructor that calls the default constructor of Ribbit Controller Base. There are a few other things that we can address in the home controller. For example, the follow and the unfollow action methods need to know what user that we are following or unfollowing. So we can do that either by the user ID or the username. Let's stick with the username in this case. So we will add those parameters to those methods. And then to see if these methods work, we can modify the message for the exception. We could simply say username followed and then unfollowed for the unfollowed method. The profiles doesn't need any external information, neither does followers, following. Create does, but we need a lot of information here. So we're just going to stick with this, not having any parameters, and we will come back and change that when we focus on the home controller and its appropriate views. Let's move on to the account controller. So let's add that controller. And this is one of those controllers that we will not need an index action method. But since I chose create a new class, it didn't generate that index method for me, which that's okay because we didn't need it, and we immediately want to inherit from Ribbit controller base. There are 3 methods that we need for this account controller. We need a signup method, a login method, and a logout method. So I'm going to paste those in. I'm going to add a using statement for system.web.mvc for the action result data type. And we need to mark the sign up and the login as a post requests, because that is getting information from the user. We also need to validate the anti-forgery token for these. The logout action method can kind of go either way. We can make it a post only, or we can allow get or posts. But I guess we should probably just make this a post request so that we can validate the anti-forgery token, and then we can just log out. And since this is going to be a simple method, we could just use the security class and then log out. But when we do log out, we need to redirect the user back to the landing page. So we will throw a new not implemented exception. Let's now create our user controller. And we will need 3 methods for this controller. We need the index to display the user's profile itself. Then we need a followers and a following. We get the username from the URL, the first segment of our URL. So that is going to be passed as a parameter to our methods. So we can call this username. And then our index can throw a not implemented exception. And for the message, we can just say list for and then username. And then our followers and our following methods will follow the same pattern. We need the username for the parameter, and then the not implemented exception message is going to display something useful. And finally, we want our profile controller. This is going to be so that we can view our own profile, which will have our display name, our website, and our bio, and so that we can edit that as well. So let's call this a profile controller. This needs to, of course, inherit the Ribbit controller base. The index action method is fine because that is going to display the initial page, which is going to have our form. But then we will need to edit that form. So we can do that with an edit action method. This will be a post request, so we do need to ensure that we mark this as a post request. And this will have a parameter, but we don't know what exactly it's going to be yet. So we will just leave this as an empty parameter list. We will throw a new not implemented exception, and then we will mark this as a post method, and we also want to validate the anti-forgery token. And since we are dealing with the profiles here, we will need the profile service, which we haven't written yet. But we'll do that whenever we focus on the profile itself. And before we go, let's try to run this application. Let's first of all see if it builds, and then let's try out some of the action methods. The ones that I am particularly concerned about are the user controller. I want to ensure that if we type a username, then we would go to that controller. So in the browser, I added a username. That's the username that I use, JW McPeak. And then we can see that we are in the user controller for the index action method. And lo and behold, we are throwing this not implemented exception. So if we continue on, we will see that exception in the browser. And here for our message, we can see the list for JW McPeak. So if we wanted to see the followers, we could just tack on followers. And once again, we can see that we are in the user controller. We are in the followers method. And our message is followers for JW McPeak. So that particular route is working well. Let's try something on the home controller. Let's do followers. If everything works, we should see an exception, and we do. We are in the home controller class and the followers action method. Let's try out the logout action method on our account controller. So let's go to account/logout, and we get a 404. Oh, but we marked that as post, didn't we? So yes, we would get a 404 because we don't have a method to handle GET requests. So we're just going to say that this works. The only other controller we haven't tried is profile. So let's do profile. And if we do the index, we will get this exception because we don't have a view for the index action method. But if we go to edit, we get a 404 because edit is for post requests. So we have our controllers stubbed out. The next thing we need to do is start to get our views organized. We'll start with the layout, and we'll also create a base class for our view pages, which will be very similar to the base controller class that we wrote in this lesson.